Hey heroes, welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below along with other places you can find me. Calvin Montgomery Rankin was born in Passaic, New Jersey, the son of a government scientist named Dr. Ronald Rankin. When he was young, Calvin attempted to investigate his father's lab unsupervised and accidentally knocked over a beaker, causing an accident that released an unidentified gas. While he couldn't help but breathe in a considerable amount of the vapor, it seemed to have no immediate effect. But then, during his high school years, he discovered that he was able to mimic the talents and abilities of others as long as he was near them. As he grew older, he succeeded in athletics and academics, causing his ego to swell. The other students, meanwhile, began to grow suspicious of his seemingly unnatural talents. Eventually, his father became aware of the chemical accident and suspected that it had either endowed his son with uncanny abilities or simply unlocked them. You see, before Calvin was born, his father worked on clandestine projects for the Canadian government and was involved in experimentation that may have resulted in Calvin's capacity for genetic mutation. There are also conflicting reports regarding whether or not Calvin would technically be considered a mutant, with several sources disputing the notion. In any event, Ronald Rankin evidently blamed himself for what happened, and with anti-mutant hysteria on the rise, he moved with his son to an isolated cave to keep him safe from those who would persecute him. He began working on a machine, claiming it would allow Calvin to permanently retain his mimicked abilities. However, the amount of power used by their hidden lab caused blackouts across the county, drawing the attention of an angry mob. Ronald attempted to protect his son by collapsing the entrance to the mine they were in, but underestimated the power of the explosives he used and was caught up in the blast. Calvin escaped, but the machine was buried and his father was gone, leaving him bitter and vengeful. He attended Metro College and pursued a woman named Vera Cantor, but became angry and jealous when she started dating Hank McCoy. Of course, Hank was secretly the X-Man Beast, and when Calvin attacked, he found that he was able to perfectly mimic his mutant powers. Not only that, but when Hank's close friend Bobby Drake, secretly Iceman, attempted to intervene, Calvin was able to copy his abilities as well. Naturally, that caused a group of onlookers to conclude that Calvin was the mutant and drove him away. Regardless, having seen news reports of the X-Men's exploits, Calvin had deduced the identities of two of their members. He soon discovered another when he copied the telekinetic abilities of Jean Grey, Marvel Girl. By following her, he learned the location of the X-Mansion and traveled there the following day, claiming he wished to apologize to Hank and join the team. However, Professor Xavier quickly deduced that he really wished to challenge them. I will also note that here, in his first appearance, Cerebro specifically registers Calvin as a non-mutant. In any event, he donned a costume of his own design and attacked the X-Men with their own powers as the Mimic. He was even able to copy their physical mutations as he sprouted wings to match the Angel. Although it was still 5 against 1 and the X-Men were able to use teamwork to fight him. In the end, the Mimic was able to abduct Jean and escape back to the mine. When the rest of the X-Men followed, he used their powers to unearth his father's machine, intending on using it to retain their abilities permanently. However, it seems the machine had the opposite effect and that Ronald Rankin was actually planning on removing his son's abilities. With Calvin powerless, Professor Xavier was able to erase his memories of their encounter, preserving the safety of his students. But fate can be a powerful force, and only weeks later a lab accident at school restored Calvin's memories and powers. He confronted the X-Men once again, but this time legitimately wanted to join them. Of course, that was primarily because he needed to be close to them to mimic their mutant powers. Hoping to turn an enemy into an ally, Xavier made Mimic the deputy leader of the X-Men, a role that Cyclops had recently stepped down from. Meanwhile, a mind-controlling supervillain known as the Puppet Master was plotting to use the X-Men against his enemies, the Fantastic Four. Initially, he attempted to seize control of Xavier, but the Professor's mind was too powerful, and so he instead targeted the Mimic, fastening a doll from radioactive clay that he could use to control him. This initially worked as Calvin turned against the X-Men, but he resisted Master's mental commands when he was ordered to kill them. Ultimately, he was able to hold out long enough for Angel to seize the doll and destroy it, freeing the Mimic's mind. Calvin continued training under Professor X after that, although the other X-Men resented his arrogance. During this time, he helped prevent the Professor from being abducted by agents of the criminal organization Factor 3. Regardless, the responsibilities of leadership had failed to curb his ego and insolence the way that the Professor had hoped they would. Tired of his attitude and fearing he would be a liability in future battles, Xavier removed him from the team. Soon after he left, the X-Men were attacked by the Super Adaptoid, an android with the copied abilities of several Avengers. And so when Mimic returned to air his grievances about his dismissal, he saw the Adaptoid overpowering the X-Men. Still wanting to take revenge on the world, Calvin offered to join forces with the Super Adaptoid, who wanted to convert superhumans into adaptoids like himself. However, Cyclops warned the Mimic that allowing himself to be transformed would cost him his free will. And Calvin ultimately came to his senses when the Adaptoid declared that they would kill Cyclops. The Super Adaptoid and the Mimic fought, each one possessing the power to copy abilities. Noticing that they were immune to each other's powers, however, Mimic used the Professor's telepathy to compel the Super Adaptoid into attempting to copy him. When it did so, the effort caused a backlash that robbed the Adaptoid of his Avengers powers and Mimic of the X-Men's. With the battle over, a once again depowered Calvin parted ways with the X-Men on good terms, apologizing for his selfish attitude. He returned to college to complete his degree and eventually got together with Vera. Sometime later, his powers returned again, leading him to suspect that his mimicry abilities were inherent and not solely the result of his original lab accident. After that, his powers came and went, growing stronger each time, making them difficult to control. Eventually, he started to inadvertently drain the life energy of those he copied, leading to muscle atrophy and fatal organ failure. With the range of his powers growing as well, he relocated to an isolated cabin in the Canadian wilderness. Vera, meanwhile, sought out Hank McCoy for help, who by this point had become a renowned expert in genetic mutation. He started working on a way to stabilize Calvin, but the two were soon interrupted. The Incredible Hulk had wandered into Calvin's area of influence and quite literally dropped in. Hank revealed his furry true form as the Beast, but was quickly overpowered by the Green Goliath. Calvin, however, attempted to use the situation by copying a fatal amount of gamma radiation from the Hulk. His plan to end his own life seemed to work, as Hank and Vera left him for dead in the solitary cabin. But Calvin survived by copying the healing powers of a nearby Canadian super agent. He awakened once more, but his powers continued to shift and change. While he no longer drained his targets of their energy, this time he physically transformed into the one he copied. At the same time, the aforementioned Canadian agent Wolverine was making his public debut in a battle against the Hulk. Still locked onto him, Calvin became a near-perfect duplicate of Wolverine, complete with adamantium claws. Trapped in this form for years, he remained in isolation and was nearly driven mad, having inherited Wolverine's berserker rage. He attempted to stabilize himself with his father's machine and kept himself heavily medicated. He eventually lost control and killed several people while stealing more pills. Of course, the real Wolverine was initially blamed for these murders. The whole situation eventually led to a clash with the Hulk, who was in his more intelligent gray form at the time. But it soon became clear that the imposter Wolverine was distressed and desperately trying to maintain control of himself. Calvin explained to the Hulk exactly who he was and what he had been through. Of course, it was only a matter of time before those two were tracked down by the real Wolverine. In the end, the three joined forces and returned to Ronald Rankin's hidden lab, where they discovered that Calvin's father had left behind a piece of himself in his complex machines, similar to an artificial intelligence. Ronald explained that he had generated a beacon to keep the Mimic's abilities under control, but it lost its effectiveness once he stepped out of range. However, the effort of manifesting in holographic form to convey this information overtaxed the machine's systems, burning out their circuits. Not wanting to rely on drugs or machines to maintain control, Calvin followed Wolverine's advice and traveled to Japan. There he studied and meditated, regaining his original form, although his powers continued to grow beyond his control. With help from Xavier, he relocated once again, this time to an isolated facility in Siberia. He regained the powers of the original 5 X-Men, this time retaining them permanently. But the stronghold he stayed at was eventually targeted and destroyed by the psionic monster known as Onslaught. We've talked about him on the channel before, but he's essentially a creature born from the dark impulses of both Professor Xavier and Magneto. When the Mutant Team X force arrived to investigate the destruction of the facility, Mimic assumed that they were responsible and attacked. However, he was soon overwhelmed after not only copying the abilities of X-Force members Warpath and Sunspot, but augmenting them. Calvin was then teleported away by Onslaught himself, who granted him complete control over his abilities. In exchange, the Mimic became an agent of Onslaught, working alongside fellow operative the Blob. But eventually Onslaught was defeated in a large battle involving the X-Men, the Avengers, and the Fantastic Four. After that, Mimic and Blob briefly worked for Sledge, a mysterious member of the Deviant race. However, Mimic was then captured by the anti-mutant task force Operation Zero Tolerance. That organization was headed by a human sentinel hybrid named Bastion, who worked with the US government. Professor Xavier was also being held by Operation Zero Tolerance, having been taken into custody in the wake of the Onslaught incident. During this time, Bastion confiscated computer systems from Xavier's mansion, including Cerebro, which his Prime Sentinels attempted to interface with. Bastion was eventually defeated by the X-Men and taken into S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, while Operation Zero Tolerance lost any right to operate on American soil. Mimic, however, was among several detainees to be sent to an isolated outpost in the Peruvian highlands. Tortured by his restraints, Calvin lashed out at the Prime Sentinels operating the base with a psychic attack. This outburst drew the attention of Excalibur, a super team whose members included several X-Men. They were searching for Professor Xavier, but of course found the Mimic instead. Mentally addled by his torture, Calvin attacked, but Excalibur succeeded in subduing him. He recovered and briefly stayed with the team, which disbanded not long afterwards. At some point, likely around this time, the Mimic also met Dr. Moira McTaggart. She is a woman with a complicated history, to say the least, but the important aspect for today is that she offered medical support for Excalibur. She diagnosed Calvin with bipolar disorder and prescribed him with medication that would help. The Mimic also reunited with the Blob as a member of his Brotherhood of Mutants, alongside original Brotherhood member Toad and another former agent of Onslaught, Post. And it was actually this group who found and rescued Professor Xavier from an old Hulkbuster base where he'd been held by Operation Zero Tolerance. Meanwhile, Cerebro had achieved sentience after interfacing with Bastion's Prime Sentinels and nanotechnology. Calling itself Cerebro Prime, it eventually decided that the best way to achieve world peace was to capture, catalog, and control every human being on Earth. Aware that Cerebro had become a threat, Xavier taught Blob's Brotherhood how to work as a team until he was found by the X-Men. The two teams joined forces against Cerebro Prime, and while Mimic was captured, Xavier was able to show Cerebro the error of its ways and was ultimately destroyed. The Brotherhood subsequently had a less heroic endeavors while working under the shape-shifting mutant Mystique. They were defeated by X-51, the Machine Man, and Mimic was taken into government custody. Dr. Valerie Cooper from the Commission on Superhuman Activities told Calvin that she believed he was ultimately a good guy and offered to release him in exchange for any information he could give about X-51. Although he soon reunited with the Brotherhood, who plotted to commit more crimes. During this time, there was a point at which the mad geneticist known as the High Evolutionary used a device to suppress the powers of every mutant on Earth. The Mimic was also affected by this, although he specifically mentioned not being able to call on his absorbed abilities, which could certainly be considered mutant powers even if Calvin himself wasn't a natural-born mutant. In either case, the Evolutionary's tampering was reversed, and Calvin regained the powers of the original X-Men, even after the Scarlet Witch depowered the vast majority of mutant kind. However, he still had difficulty controlling his power sometimes, at one point accidentally hitting an innocent bystander with an optic blast. And then he was approached by a man I'm sure many of you know, Norman Osborn. With his criminal activity as the Green Goblin in dispute, Osborn had been appointed the head of national security and the director of his own international peacekeeping force, Hammer, which replaced S.H.I.E.L.D. Having already assembled his own team of Avengers, primarily consisting of villains posing as heroes, Osborn decided to create a dark X-Men as well, and the Mimic accepted his invitation to join. Calvin, it seems, just wanted to do the right thing, even if it meant fighting his old allies. He fell into a depressive episode and was treated by Dr. Carla Sofin, who was herself another villain in Osborn's employ, Moonstone. One of Mimic's teammates during this time was a man named Michael Pointer, otherwise known as Weapon Omega. He's another character who's been called both human and mutant in different points, but he had the power to absorb energy from mutants, which will be relevant shortly. The Dark X-Men subsequently encountered a powerful mutant from an alternate timeline, Nate Gray, aka X-Man. When Calvin mimicked X-Man's powers, he was overwhelmed and experienced a vision of the future in which he was married to Vera Cantor. But in that vision, he again lost control of his abilities and inadvertently killed his wife and a newborn child. In a subsequent encounter, Calvin confronted X-Man, who told him that the future wasn't necessarily set in stone. However, they were interrupted by Osborn's Avengers before he could learn more. When Nate Gray escaped into Norman Osborn's mind, the Dark X-Men used Hammer's Psi Division to pursue him. That allowed Calvin to get a look at Osborn's dark side when they were attacked by his Green Goblin persona. The Goblin forced Mimic to copy Omega's powers and had them work together to drain X-Man's energy, defeating him. Nate was held captive and hooked into a machine that used his energy to sustain Michael, while Calvin began questioning his place on the team. Osborn's dark reign eventually came to an end, and Mimic remained close friends with Omega. However, Osborn's machinations had left Michael addicted to absorbing mutant energy. Calvin attempted to placate him with small amounts of his own energy, but Michael's powers started to grow out of control, possibly because Mimic wasn't a true mutant. Desperate, Calvin brought Omega to the Beast, hoping he could help. With Michael's powers building, threatening to explode, Mimic and Rogue attempted to siphon off the excess using Rogue's energy-absorbing abilities. However, that backfired when the energy was duplicated in Mimic and Rogue rather than being divided. Dejected and with time running out, Mimic returned to the site of his most heroic moment, the spot where he defeated the Super Adaptoid and sacrificed his powers to save the X-Men. He then realized that doing the same thing between Omega, Rogue, and himself might have the same effect. While this did undo the duplication of energy, saving Mimic and Rogue, Omega was still in danger. He was willing to let himself die, but Mimic convinced him to let them put him into stasis until he could be cured. Not wanting to leave his friend, Calvin remained at the school and aided the X-Men in a subsequent conflict with the Avengers. He and Rogue later worked together to thwart an attempted breakout at the supervillain prison, the Raft. Once Omega recovered, Calvin was conflicted about whether or not he should leave the school as well, but ultimately decided to move on to the next phase of his life. For a time, he and Omega worked together on more heroic pursuits, helping regular people while the X-Men were busy saving the world. Although they did briefly clash with Cyclops and his more radical team when he tried to recruit them into his mutant revolution. They escaped that conflict thanks to the powers of Forget-Me-Not, a mutant who disappeared from people's memories as soon as they stopped looking at him. Sometime later, the Mimic was abducted by Kid Cable, the time-traveling son of Cyclops and a younger version of the grizzled old Cable. This was directly related to the fact that Beast had brought the original 5 X-Men forward in time from their early years. There's a long story there that we've mentioned on the channel before and we don't really need to get into here, but the important thing is that Cable wanted to send them back to where they came from to preserve the timeline. However, the time-displaced Angel had lost his natural wings during an adventure involving a cosmic artifact called the Black Vortex. And so Cable used future technology to surgically remove Mimic's wings and transplant them onto Angel. Calvin accepted this once he knew why it was happening, and may even have agreed to it if Cable had asked first rather than abducting him. Meanwhile, a mutant hunter from the future named Ahab attempted to intervene and change the course of history by killing the young X-Men. He even believed he'd succeeded when he was attacked by someone using optic blasts and seemingly speared the young Cyclops in the chest. Of course, it wasn't Cyclops who was stabbed for attacking him, but Mimic, whose last words were that he only wanted to help. Fortunately, his sacrifice wasn't in vain, and in the end, Ahab was defeated, the original 5 X-Men were sent back, and the timeline was preserved. Furthermore, this wasn't the end of the Mimic. He has since resurfaced with his wings restored on the mutant island nation of Krakoa, and has at one point even been considered as a possible candidate if a member of the 5 needed to be replaced. The 5 being the group who are able to combine their powers to resurrect dead mutants, which may also explain Mimic's return. This means that while his mutant status has been disputed, it seems that Professor Xavier at least considers him one of his people. So maybe he really is a mutant. You guys let me know what you think in the comments below, but for now, that is the history of the Mimic. And thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!